This question is from Marcia, who says, please can you tell me the meaning of Deuteronomy 22:5? Does it literally mean that women are not allowed to wear pants? Or trousers if you're in the UK. So Deuteronomy 22:5, which was an Old Testament law, it was one of the laws of Moses for this period right here. It says, a woman must not put on men's clothing and a man must not wear women's clothing. Anyone who does this is detestable in the sight of the Lord your God. So the first question that we have to ask here is, why would God insist to the people of Old Testament Israel, under the law of Moses, that men and women both wear clothing appropriate for their own sex? What was he trying to communicate to the people of Israel at that time? And the principle here, I think very simply and very basically, is that God has designed men and women to be distinct, to be different from one another, and he wants men and women to embrace their distinctions and their differences. There's a beauty and purpose in the design of both men and women. Masculinity is good. Femininity is good. They're both designed by God, and God detests when people try to blur the lines of that distinction or invert or subvert his design, when people try to bring confusion into that. God is a God of order, and he's designed men to be men and to embrace their masculinity, and women to be women and to embrace their femininity. And it's a kind of vandalism of his creation order to get into gender bending, cross-dressing, transvesticism, transgenderism, and so forth. Now, this is where the New Covenant actually improves on the Old Covenant. So under the Old Covenant, which this is the law of Moses, it simply said, don't wear clothing of the opposite sex. But for example, that meant a man could still try and blur the lines in other ways. He could wear makeup and certain kinds of jewelry and make his hair in a certain way. He could adopt effeminate mannerisms or a voice. And technically, as long as he's not wearing female clothing, he's not breaking the letter of this law. However, he would clearly be breaking the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law that God was trying to communicate through that law is something much wider. It's that God doesn't want male and female distinctions to be subverted or inverted in any way whatsoever. So now we get into the New Covenant era, where it says God has enabled us to be ministers of his new covenant. This is a covenant not of written laws, but of the Spirit. So our task now is not just to look at the letter of the law, but to look at the spirit behind the law. What is the wider principle in this law? And of course, as we've already said, the spirit is that God wants male and female to affirm and embrace their distinctions and to keep those distinctions. And the spirit therefore covers all different eventualities. Anything designed to subvert or vandalize his design is considered sin now, whether that be through makeup or speech or mannerisms or hairstyles, or using bathrooms of the opposite sex, or entering spaces not designated for your sex, or surgery designed to give the appearance of the opposite sex. That was not covered by the Old Testament letter of the law, in the law of Moses, in the Old Covenant, but it is now covered in the spirit of the New Covenant. So I said hairstyles is another way that people can try to blur those lines. So Paul writes, isn't it obvious that it's disgraceful for men to have long hair, and isn't long hair a woman's pride and joy? For it has been given to her as a covering. But if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, and neither do God's other churches. And again, this is just affirming and confirming this same principle, that there are masculine hairstyles and there are feminine hairstyles, and hair can be used either to affirm God's creation order, or hair can be used to try and blur lines and invert and subvert God's creation order. And what God is just saying through all of this is, let men be men and embrace their masculinity, and let women be women and embrace their femininity. Anything that seeks to undo this is considered sin. So with that understanding in place, and within our current context and within the customs of our time, the question that we have to ask ourselves here is, when a woman wears pants today, are they necessarily seeking to gender bend? Is there subversion at work? And I think when you look at photos like these, for example, the answer is clearly no. These women are not trying to look like men. There's no intention here to subvert or bring confusion or to blur lines. Nobody's looking at these photos and thinking, is that a man? Is that a woman? I can't tell. I'm not sure. This still looks feminine. These women are still embracing their femininity in these examples. They're not blurring the distinctions at all. Whereas if you look at pictures like these, clearly these women are trying to blur lines and create confusion and subvert and push at the boundaries and create an androgynous appearance. And they're not just doing it through clothing, but through hairstyles and mannerisms and poses, etc. as well. I also find it interesting in lesbian relationships how one often assumes the male role, and so they take on the male image. Clearly they want to be a man, so they cut their hair like a man, they dress like a man, and that's the sin. It's when you try to take on the appearance of the opposite sex, you blur those lines, you blur the distinctions. Similarly, as a Scotsman, this is relevant for me because when Scotsmen wear kilts, and let's be honest, they're not entirely dissimilar to skirts, although only I'm allowed to say that, you're not allowed to say that. And yet when we wear them, we're clearly not trying to feminize ourselves. This, I think anyway, and you're not allowed to disagree, looks masculine. There's no intention to create confusion here. There's no inversion or subversion. Quite the opposite. It takes a real man to wear a kilt. And, I think similar things happen in other cultures as well. But on the other hand, when men wear clothing like this, clearly they are trying to create confusion and blur lines and subvert. And so this is sinful. So what I'm trying to get at here is I think it's obvious when men and women are trying to use fashion and hairstyles to take on the appearance of the opposite sex and when they're trying to blur the lines. And I think it's clear when they're not. And that's the principle that we need to bear in mind. As a woman, you can wear pants because in our culture, that isn't necessarily being done to confuse anyone. And here in Scotland anyway, guys can wear kilts because that's not being done to confuse anyone. In both cases, men and women can still fully be embracing their masculinity and their femininity. But the question is, in what spirit are you wearing them? What's your intention? What's going on in your heart? Because remember, in the New Covenant, we're judged by the heart. So what's going on in your heart by wearing what you do? Is it to blur lines? Is it to be subversive to God's creation order? Are you getting a perverse sense of joy in vandalizing God's creation order and being rebellious to that order? I think so many people do. They get a perverse sense of joy from doing it. They're pushing at the boundaries. They're being edgy. If so, if that's your intention, if that's what's going on in your heart, then it's sin. So Marcia, you're free to wear pants, and guys, in Scotland anyway, you're free to wear kilts because it's about the intention. It's about what's going on in your heart. I just want to quickly add that because God wants to maintain the beauty of his creation order and the distinction of masculinity and femininity, this is of course something that you would then expect to see Satan wanting to attack and subvert and tear down and vandalize. Therefore, Baphomet, which is a representation of Satan used especially by the Satanic Temple, it noticeably has both male and female organs at the same time, and therefore Baphomet is becoming a symbol for transgenderism and for sexual confusion in general. People pushing the LGBT agenda are beginning to look to Satan/Baphomet as a symbol for their movement. The Satanic Temple advocates for it, and it's estimated that well over half of Satanists are now coming from the LGBT community. The LGBT community are especially drawn to Satan, and the Satanists are especially saying, yeah, come, Satan approves of your confusion. There was a row recently then where a trans satanic designer was allowed to start stocking their designs in Target. And this was a message on those designs that Satan is for the blurring of lines, he's for subversion, he's for sexual confusion. And I just thought it was interesting because through things like this, I think we see that Satan is behind all of this sexual confusion right now. And there's perhaps a growing boldness in the enemy where they're beginning to come out from the shadows and reveal what's really been behind this all along. I think it's now becoming very clear, and I think that's just something to keep an eye on as we go forward. It seems like Satan's becoming a bit more bold in coming out from the shadows. It's just something to keep an eye on as we go ahead on this.